any challenge that comes up in the day. So if I've had a bad day at work, I come home, I'm looking for peace and quiet. I'm looking for comfort. I'm looking for an alleviation to all of the frustrations of the day. I may come home and my kids just had a horrible day too. And it's now up to me, instead of looking for the thing that I want, which is peace and quiet, the thing that I need to give is more of myself, love, affection. Maybe I'm in that moment because I have not been comforted at work. I now need to do comforting at home.
Welcome to Frankly Fatherhood, where we discuss and explore all things fatherhood. Today we have a professor, a mentor, and a friend of mine, Dr. Josh Fullman. He is a gentleman that he is married. He has 3 kids. What are the ages of your children? I know one's in college, one's a teenager.
Judah's 20, about to become 21. Ezra is 14, and Malachi's 10.
So we're seeing you're experiencing the range of development as far as fatherhood is concerned. So I would love to open up with a few questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
You spend your life helping people find words for things they cannot say. That's been something that I've experienced quite a bit. Has fatherhood ever handed you something that you couldn't find the word for? If so, what did that look like?
Has fatherhood ever handed me something I could not find the words for? Well, every day, perhaps. I rarely know immediately the right thing to say. I always find myself carefully weighing my words, thinking through reactions to my responses. And some people have accused me in the past of that being a self-censorship. And maybe there's something to that criticism. But I tend to think of it more as wisdom, especially when it comes to my children. I don't want to teach my kids something that they may not be developmentally ready for. What I might say to my 20-year-old, I'm not necessarily going to say to my 10-year-old. So I guess as a humorous anecdote about this, I remember the first time that our oldest asked me what sex was. He was 7 years old, and I was backing out of the driveway, and then he just drops this bomb out of nowhere. And so I can't tell you the wave of panic that just rushed over me. I was thinking, how in the world I'm going to answer this question? I'd already thought before, I knew this was going to come up someday, but I figured it was several years before I'd ever have to deal with this. And so I put the car in drive, and I took a deep breath, and I started stalling for time. And I said, well, buddy, where did you hear that word? And he said, it's on your driver's license. It says sex, M. I tell you, I have never been more relieved in my life. I was like, we can save that question for another day. That's okay. So just sex M just means I'm a boy. That's it. But that would be an example of where you're rarely prepared. Even if you've thought about it beforehand, you're rarely prepared for the moments when they come and the questions that are asked that are revealing the state of someone's psyche, right? So their soul. So I come across questions all the time I don't know how to handle. But I try to do at least 2 things. One is I always try to come back to scripture. How might God view this situation? What does he have to say about this? That's oftentimes helpful. Sometimes it's not, because there's not always a scriptural answer for every question that comes down the pike. But it can be very helpful when it comes to questions of loss or doubt or decision making or lots of deep existential issues. I don't get a whole lot of existential questions from a 7-year-old, but you'd be surprised every now and then. But 2, I try to temper my answers with a kind of, rhetorical qualification, saying things like, this is what I think may be true, or this is what's been my experience, or this is how I might make my decision. Sometimes I'm very convinced of my own rightness. Well, I thought about this. I know the answer. But that's not always helpful to someone who's asking a deep question, who hasn't necessarily gone through all the steps to come up with the answer that I might have. So when I am a little decided in my beliefs, I try to think about how my hearers might receive what it is I'm saying. Will I be coming off as too opinionated or too forthright? So recognizing that wisdom is always a work in progress helps me from becoming too absolutist in my convictions. So when the questions come, hopefully I respond to them with a certain level of humility.
So there's just a recognition that there's a lot that you don't know. As a father, especially, and that's okay.
Especially as a father.
Despite the fact that you're always studying and you're reading on these things and you're always taking the time to help people, one of the most valuable things is stepping back and saying, let me make sure that I approach this from and it sounds like you ask questions a lot and then you leave it open so that your child is able to think through this themselves. So You're not answering all of it for them. You're giving them the opportunity to find the answer, become problem solvers, right?
Yeah. I mean, the best kind of conversations I have with my kids are when they ask a question, I give a response, and hopefully follow that up with a question to them so that the conversation keeps going.
So there's that, constantly working them through that. So you're almost like mapping it out for them. And then the other thing I found valuable is searching the scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so you're not going to always know everything. And so I'm a therapist for children and adolescents, and I've been doing this for almost a decade. And I've seen all kinds of things. And I just remember this is one of the openers for the channel, right? I remember when I first held my child, I came to the realization, wow, there's so much that I just do not know. It really humbles you, and it takes you down the path of, okay, not only do I not know very much about this, but my child doesn't either. So I kind of need to help them figure out how to learn, but also how to be okay with not knowing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a very interesting. And so searching the scriptures and being willing to search for outside sources. And so very, very valuable. I'd be curious to know the answer to this next one. You have 3 children, all developmentally, just in different places. What is one distinct thing each of your children has taught you about yourself? And which was the most difficult lesson and why?
So there is nothing that fully prepares you for being a parent. There's no absolutely no other experience like it on earth. There's no handbook, right? That's just this all-consuming, identity redefining experience of caring entirely for another human being, someone who relies completely on you, someone who's in a position of total dependence. And they're looking to you for sustenance and shelter and leadership because they know even less than you do. And they don't have the ability to make decisions and care for themselves and be responsible for themselves the way adults are. So, one thing I would say is to any of your interested viewers, if it's something that you haven't experienced yet, you can't be prepared for it, and you can't really know what it's like until you do it. It's experiential knowledge. There are several ways in our lives that the Spirit sanctifies us. He grows us into the image of Christ. But I think that the 2 primary ways occur right at home. One is which it occurs when we conform ourselves to our husband or wife, the daily dying to self as we become one flesh. But the other is through parenting, that taking responsibility for another human being who's entirely dependent on you and may even lash out at you for that dependence. So watching my own children, I see all of my own flaws daily reflected back at me. In case I ever get too full of myself, I am daily reminded that I'm too irritable. I'm too silly when I should be serious, and too serious when I should be silly. What else? I'm sullenly stubborn. I think I'm more right than I actually am. So all these things are your kids are constant reminders about how sinful you are. For my oldest son, I learned that I'm too cautious at times and need to be more of a risk taker. For my middle son, I'm not always comfortable enough in my own skin. And for my youngest son, I guess I would learn that I am very quick to please others. So, yes, I'm frequently reminded of my own sinfulness and my own inadequacies. At the same time, I'm also reminded through being a father that you get to see yourself, not just in all of your flaws, but you actually get to see yourself as God sees you. So, in spite of all those flaws, I also get to see my strengths mirrored in my children. My oldest son's very creative, does a lot of writing and drawing. And so I'm reminded of the delight of creativity. And in that way, also reminded of God's own creativity. My middle son reminds me to always have fun. He is an incredible jokester, a little too much at times, but always he's trying to suck the marrow out of life. And my youngest son teaches me the joy of helping others, taking ownership and responsibility. Even at a very young age, he's always doing things for other people without even being asked. So scripture tells us, even in the early pages in Exodus, that God's wrath is temporary, but his loving kindness is from generation to generation. And my hope is that in spite of my own flaws and inadequacies and sin, that his loving kindness is reflected in me to my children, to their children. And it becomes this multi-generational chain of proclaiming God's goodness. So I guess I'm also reminded that I'm being trained in this fatherhood process, just like I'm training my own children. And this is another reason why you can't ever replicate the experience of parenting except to be in it. Because if it is one of the primary ways in which the Spirit sanctifies us, then to not fully engage in the process is to miss out on an incredible depth of personal growth.
To miss out. So, out of all of those, being too cautious and such, what would you say is the most difficult one?
That may depend on the day.
And maybe
So,
that's the answer, Dr. Fullman. Maybe that's the answer. I don't know. I'm curious to know what you have to say. Maybe that's the answer, especially based on everything you've been saying. Sometimes it is depending on the day.
we all experience good days and bad days and in
Mhm.
between. But just in the we're coming out of this Lenten season recently, in the same way that we choose to give up something good for something greater. For example, choosing to fast in order to spend more time in prayer. Any challenge that comes up in the day. So if I've had a bad day at work, I come home, I'm looking for peace and quiet. I'm looking for comfort. I'm looking for an alleviation to all of the frustrations of the day. I may come home and my kids just had a horrible day too. And it's now up to me, instead of looking for the thing that I want, which is peace and quiet, the thing that I need to give is more of myself, love, affection. Maybe I'm in that moment because I have not been comforted at work. I now need to do comforting at home. And that may be one of the hardest things to do. And yet it may be the thing that gives me the most comfort. And I'm reminded of what Paul mentions this quite a bit in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, that it is through the comfort of God that we find comfort. But that doesn't happen when things are easy and comfortable and delightful. Those things often come through challenge and difficulty and struggle. And so the sanctification process is typically painful. It happens when we don't expect it. It happens when we don't feel ready for it. And it happens in ways that are come at personal sacrifice and cost. But that's the path of Jesus.
So, one of the most difficult lessons that you've experienced, if you were to just consolidate all of it into one thing, would be to be of service, even if everything in you feels like it preferred to be served.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Now, qualification, I don't always do this very well. My kids may tell you I don't do it very often. I don't know, but it takes effort, especially. I was raised in a fairly traditional disciplinarian kind of home. I think my first reaction to things is probably to, I guess, squash bad behavior and address it so that it doesn't become disrespect and things like that. Sometimes what I need to do, though, is resist that impulse. Sometimes I need to give it rein and allow it to do its work. Sometimes I need to resist that impulse because that's not what my kids need at that moment. And so even that process of having to stop and reassess and determine what's the wise thing to do here, that's hard because you're not reacting the way that you instinctively want to react.
The way that system was built,
Sure.
right? Not necessarily by God, but by our parents.
Mhm.
And that's not to vilify. I think that's just an understanding of we're all fallible.
Right.
We all have shortcomings, and that, and I think that kind of leads us into some of what we're going to be talking about next. So I'm very curious to pick your brain on this one as well. Uh, our fathers show up the best they can, and we are all doing the same. None of us leave our child unscathed. You have read enough of the human soul to know the variety of consequences that befall our children when we fail as fathers. Tell me, what does the poet in you know about your own children that the father in you has not yet had the courage to act on?
The poet in me. Um, One of the most powerful representations in poetry of fatherhood that I've seen actually comes from a poem I read many years ago. Robert Hayden wrote Those Winter Sundays. Very brief, very beautiful poem. It's about a speaker who looks back on his childhood and he remembers his father chopping wood outside on very cold Sunday mornings with snow all around him while the rest of the family slept in and enjoyed the warm house. And so the whole poem acts as kind of a conceit for how parents are constantly sacrificing for their kids. And the kids never really get it, right? And the truth is, they won't get it until they become parents themselves. I think this too is probably part of the sanctifying process. I'm reminded how Moses asked God, why did you put me in charge of all these Israelites? Why do I have to put up with them? which is really a good representation of fatherhood too, right? But several times God says he's going to wipe out the Israelites. But Moses, who has been complaining, steps up and he begs God not to. Moses becomes the intercessor. Moses becomes the Christ figure. And once you have ownership over other people, or maybe better say responsibility over people, you take ownership for their care, you take up the position of Christ. Henri Nouwen is a 20th century Catholic writer and writes a beautiful book called The Return of the Prodigal Son, where he analyzes the parable in Luke 15 and Rembrandt's picture, The Return of the Prodigal Son. And he makes a really great argument that we have all spent time as the prodigal son. And when we come to Christ, we know that, right? The longer we've been in the Father's house, we all spend time as the older son, right? Now we know the rules, now we know how things go, and we can be fairly judgmental over the prodigal, right? But the whole purpose, Nouwen says, the whole purpose of our walk with Christ is not to be the prodigal son, not to be the older son, but to become the Father. There's this transformation process where fatherhood teaches us to become like our Heavenly Father. And so those two texts in particular, I think have been fairly formative for me. But to your question in terms of not having the courage to act, I have not yet had the experience of my children rejecting or hating me. They've said things like that before, right? But in terms of a true and genuine break, we have fairly good relationships with our boys. We've cultivated having the right kinds of relationships with them at the right times in their lives. But I haven't been Abraham slaughtering Isaac, and I haven't been God commanding Abraham to slay his son. So there comes a time, and I've become more aware of this recently, especially as our oldest has started to leave. There comes a time when the son must reject the father, either out of rebellion to the father's heart and his character and his rules, or out of the natural need to just leave and become his own person. Now, I guess sometimes those two desires can be identical, but all of us need to leave and become our own person. All of us need to leave, eventually become the father ourselves. There's a literary critic, Harold Bloom, who calls this klinomen. It's a Greek term, and it's when an author has been influenced by a poet who deliberately turns away from that influence to become his own kind of poet. And he uses the example of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the 18th century author who loved the 17th century author Milton, just loved Milton, but he had to stand on his own as a different kind of poet. And he had to write against Milton. I think this tension kind of works its way into fathers and sons, and mothers and daughters as well, from my observations. We watch the father our whole lives. We learn to do what he does, but we also have to make decisions, some of them good, some of them bad, some of them just natural, part of the process, where we are not going to do those things identically to our own fathers. We're going to have to do some of those things on our own. And we end up repudiating our fathers. And unless we're very careful, ironically, we end up repeating our fathers and what they taught us. Sometimes the pervasiveness of a parent's influence exists when we simply instinctively make a decision, or we instinctively decide to parent in a certain way, because that's what we saw our parents do. And so some of the things we hate, some of the things we love, and unless we're intentional, we're going to end up repeating a lot of those things. So all of us have to go through this process. And the Lady Fullman and I have been tremendously blessed. As I said, so far we have a great relationship with our sons, but there may come a time when they have to hate us. And I mean that literally and, as the poet, metaphorically too, as part of the process of simply standing on their own. So we haven't fully experienced this yet. So to answer your question about courage, I hope I have the courage to meet that challenge with grace. And I guess even more so, I hope the maturity process completes itself in our own sons so that they spend less time looking backward with anxiety and more time taking responsibility for their own children. If we've done our own job well, they're going to care less about us as they grow up and more time looking to the future, becoming the fathers they need to be.
So you want them to have the tools to look forward. And the way in which you go about doing that is by being open, being able to ask questions, be curious, look to scripture, be open to your own flaws as well throughout this process and what our children reveal in us that we're struggling with. For example, the difficulty of serving when you're suffering yourself,
right.
Through that process, and how this is all kind of a reflection of our relationship with God, Christ's relationship with his Father, God's relationship with the Israelites and so on and so forth. It's just all kind of interwoven with each other, very hyperlinked. And so I absolutely love it. And I'm really curious if you were to summarize this into one word. If I said, frankly, fatherhood is, what would that be?
Self-denial.
Frankly, fatherhood. Well, as Dr. Fullman so kindly put it, frankly, fatherhood is self-denial. And that'll be all.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you for
Sure.
your time.
Yeah, absolutely.